Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. Today's episode is titled Unraveling the Revelation, Part 7. In this episode, we will be looking at a few key leaders of the Church of God Reformation movement that had a connection to the book of Revelation and prophetic ministries. Our first is Sister McCutcheon, Lillie S McCutcheon. She was born in 1921 and she died in 1999. Sister Lillie was ordained in Springfield, Ohio by F. G. Smith in 1947. Some have said that they believe that his gift of prophecy was given to her. He actually died about 3 months after he had ordained her. Sister Lillie pastored the Church of God in Newton Falls, Ohio for 43 long years. She was the author of 4 books. The most widely distributed book was called The Symbols Speak and was written in 1964. The second book is called Faith, Our Experience in Action. The third book, If I Be Lifted Up. And the fourth book, God's Magnificent Masterpiece in 1996, just 3 years before she died. Now, there's another book about her that was written, and it's called She Came Preaching, The Life and Ministry of Lillie S. McCutcheon, and it was written by Barry Callan. In this slide, you see a picture of three of her books, and a picture of her on the lower right-hand side. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of the last charts that she was putting together when she passed away, and I was able to get some pictures of those, and you see those on your screen there. You will notice that they have the same general themes as the charts that was used by F. G. Smith that we showed in our previous podcast. A funny story about Sister McCutcheon. It was said that one night a fly flew in her mouth as she was speaking, causing her to hack and choke until she was finally able to spit it out. She then straightened her skirt, gained her composure, and said, "He was a stranger, and yet I took him in." The audience was hysterical. Sister Lillie McCutcheon certainly had a way of interacting with people. She was a very pleasant person. The next individual that we want to look at today is Sister Jeanne Trovato. She was born in 1929. And she passed away in 2015. Here you see some pictures of the charts that she used, which are strikingly like the series of charts that was used by F. G. Smith and also Lillie McCutcheon. You also see a picture of her book titled The Seven Sealed Scrolls. A little bit of background about Sister Trovato, Sister Jeanne, I called her. I met her. She was a wonderful lady. She was converted in 1957 at the age of 27 while watching a Billy Graham crusade that was happening at the Madison Square Garden. She was raised up under Brother Harold Boyer, the pastor of Maiden Lane Church of God in Springfield, Ohio. She was a pastor, an evangelist, an author, a radio and television, and she also had a radio and television ministry. Sister Jeanne pastored independent congregation of the Church of God for about 20 years. She was listed in the yearbook from 1991 until 1997. She began to see a lot of changes from what she had experienced when she first got saved and was attending the Church of God in Springfield. And she decided that it was no longer acceptable for her, and she offered her and gave her ordination papers back to the general offices in Anderson, Indiana, and then she went independent after that. After 12 years of extensive study in Revelation prophecy, she was called herself to a prophetic ministry. She published her first book in 1999, and then her second book, which was titled Mystery Babylon, was published in 2003. Both of these books, I believe, are available through the Reformation publishers. Now, Sister Jeanne was also more of what we would call a sixth seal preacher, although she focused a lot about the message of the seventh seal. But Sister Jeanne, as well as Sister McCutcheon, they divided up the Revelation into 4 church ages: the Apostolic Age, the Medieval Age, the Sectarian Age, and then the final Restoration Age. So they maintained the same structure that Brother Warner had introduced to the church, and also taught the church historic interpretation. Now, as I mentioned, she gave her ordination papers back to the folks over in Anderson, Indiana, and from that point on, she became very strong anti-Church of God Anderson focus in her ministry. The next person I'd like to talk about is Fay Martin. He was born in 1886, and he died in 1984. Brother Fay Martin entered the ministry in about 1911, and he was a Church of God pastor and an evangelist. He established a Church of God congregation in Palmyra, New York, as well as the New York State Camp Meeting. He pastored in Washington, D.C. for 40 years. He was the author of a well-known and well-respected book called Availing Prayer. This book has not only been published by Warner Press, but it was also published by Faith and Victory Publishing House. He also, and that was in 1929. He also wrote a book called The Holy Spirit versus Modern Tongues in 1992, when tongues was very much an issue in the United States as well as other places. And both of these books were published by the Gospel Trumpet Company or Warner Press. He wrote several tracts and 2 books on the book of Revelation. The first one is titled God's Light on Revelation, and was printed in 1938, and it was printed for the author by Faith Publishing House. And he wrote a book called Latter-day Message on Revelation. I'm not sure when that was published, but it was self-published. Now, Brother Martin was acquainted with F.G. Smith and regarded Revelation explained as having, quote unquote, a special meaning for him. And he was actually endorsed by F.G. Smith. Here's a picture of the book Availing Prayer. In the Faith and Victory paper, this quote was in there, and it says, Availing Prayer by Fay C. Martin is one of the best books on the subject of prayer. Here's the chapel that Brother Martin pastored there in Washington, D.C. It looks like it has been sold, but this is where he pastored for 40-some years. Now, this is a picture of his chart, and I really like his chart. I had not seen a chart like this before. So what he basically did was he started across the top with the 1st century and went clear over into the 20th century, followed by Judgment, the final Judgment. And he also then, on the left-hand side, shows the 7 series in Revelations and puts little pictures on them. And it kind of shows of where they found their place or where they were located in his interpretation of Revelation. I find this very easy to follow and understand. And I have had copies made of this. Now, this brother was somewhat, for me, at least for me, was somewhat of an enigma. And I would like to do some further study and evaluation on him. If anyone knows him or knows any information about him, please contact me. I would like to gather as much as I can regarding him and his life. So his book, his big book on Revelation, and I say big book, it was 443 pages. It was written in 1938. Now this is just 5 years after Brother Goodnight wrote his book, and we're going to talk about Brother Goodnight later on. So he was an early advocate of the seventh seal. Brother Goodnight had an awareness of Brother Martin, and even advertised one of his books in the back of one of Goodnight's book. In fact, it was the 1933 booklet. Brother Martin is listed in the yearbook from 1918 until 1930, and then he was removed from the yearbook. Now that could have been because he removed himself, or he didn't send his paperwork in, or possibly he was even removed from the fellowship of the church. I'm not sure what the details are on that. But 1930 is that key date that we've been talking about in this podcast. So just some casual observations as I've studied and read his books. Here's a quote found on page 6 of the book we just referenced. It says this: "Thus it appears that 1980 AD is to see a total eclipse of the Reformation movement of the Church of God, together with its multiplied and ever multiplying factions." So rather than looking at 1980 as the date for the second coming of Christ, he viewed 1980 as a major milestone with regard to the light, if you will, of the Reformation movement Church of God. So he viewed that basically that by 1980 the movement would have gone into darkness. That's the way I interpret that whenever he says a total eclipse. He boldly proclaimed that the Church of God Reformation movement had apostatized. That's on page 440 of his book. Now, Brother Martin did not hold the traditional view of sanctification, as had been previously held by Brother Warner and the brethren down through the years. In fact, he mentioned holiness groups a lot in a disparaging manner, in much the same way that D.S. Warner did, but for different reasons. He also took issue with the concept that the Church of God would be the last Reformation. He did not believe that, and he believed that there could be and there would be reformations that would take place much in addition to the Church of God. Our next person is Dr. E. Marie Strong. She was born in 1913 and she died in 1995. She was a professor over at Anderson College, and she was there she taught New Testament for 36 years. Now, she taught Revelation differently. She basically, let me just read this. This is the title of her book. It's called Basic Teachings from Patmos, and it was published in 1980. And this is kind of a summation of that book. It applies Revelation to the Roman Empire, with Emperor Domitian being the first beast, the imperial cult being the second beast, and Satan being the dragon. Later on in 1996, her and two other individuals, one by the name of Sharon Pearson and the other one by the name of Dan Harmon, worked together to produce a book called A Common Sense Approach to the Book of Revelation. Now, I would like to read, I believe this is the preface of that book. This is what it says. Scholars and preachers have given us so many different interpretations of the book of Revelation that it's perplexing. The opinions have been many and the conclusions too weird. Marie Strong says, the basic message got lost somewhere in the morass of speculation that must puzzle even the angels. Dr. Strong leads us into the book of Revelation to identify the core or eternal truths that applies to all people and all ages. She believes Revelation had immediate relevance for first Christians who read it as well as for believers today. A common sense approach highlights that truth and applies it to our daily lives. Now, this may seem strange for those of us that have been exposed to, pretty much, in my case, all my life, to the church historic interpretation of Revelation. Here we have an individual that's associated with the Church of God Reformation movement who viewed the book of Revelation much like the preterists do. And we will talk about that in more detail. So here is an example of someone that had a completely different viewpoint of Revelation. The next person I want to talk about is Richard Bradley. Richard Bradley was born in 1938, and he just died recently in 1920. He was associated with the Pastors Fellowship, a group of ministers who work together and get together in Winchester, Kentucky. This is kind of the conservative arm of the Church of God Reformation movement. Their concern has always been that the doctrines and the teachings of the Church of God Reformation have not been emphasized as much as they should have been, and so they have set out to try to correct that. And as part of their overall fellowship, they've produced a number of books, number of writings, and also reprinted through the Reformation publishers. They've reprinted a lot of the old Church of God books. Now, Brother Bradley was a pastor for 24 years, and he was an evangelist since 1987. He authored 3 books, and they are as follows: The Bible and Today's Tongues, The Bible and Today's Wine, and Scenes from the Throne. Now, this last book, Scenes from the Throne, was written in 2005, and it's a 612-page compilation of decades of messages preached about the book of Revelation. He held the interpretation very similar to F.G. Smith and Lillie McCutcheon, in that he believed that it should be interpreted in a church historic manner. Now, this book is available through Reformation publishers, and it is about, I'm going to say, about maybe 2 inches thick. It's a very interesting read. It takes a little while to get through it, but I've enjoyed looking through it and gleaning information from it. Now, he's passed away, but someone has captured some of his lectures and put them online. And these lectures are available at the link there. And underneath the link, you can actually see the address there. So I'll read it for you, and then you could pause this particular screen and use that as the address to type into Google, and it will take you to these presentations. So let me read it. https://lectures.org/lectures. So basically what it says is it's eastdistrict.org/lectures-in-Revelation. Okay, the last person I want to talk about today is Otto Linn. Now, Brother Linn is quite interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born in 1887 and he died in 1965. His father was from Sweden and he was ordained, Brother Linn was, in 1912. And he was the editor of a religious periodical. Originally from Kansas, he joined the Gospel Trumpet family in June of 1907. He worked as a poultry farmer. Now, Brother Linn also had attended the University of Chicago and obtained his doctorate degree in philosophy in 1935. Now, the University of Chicago also has a divinity program there, and I'm not sure if Brother Otto, I'm not sure how much exposure he had to that side of that university, but he may well have had some exposure to that kind of training. Brother Linn was a professor of New Testament and Greek at Anderson College. He moved in the early 1930s to help establish Pacific Bible College in Portland, Oregon, where he became dean, and he was the dean from 1942 until 1955. Brother Emerson Wilson actually attended this school for a very brief time, but quickly decided it was not for him and returned back to his place in Newark, Ohio. Brother Otto was a member of the board for the American Revised Standard Edition of the New Testament, which was published in 1946. He also represented the Church of God on a multi-denominational advisory board for a completely revised Bible, which was published in 1952. Brother Linn authored 5 Bible commentaries, beginning in 1941 and ending in 1944. The first one was in 1941, and it covers, the title is Studies in the New Testament from the Gospel and Acts. Second one in 1942, Studies in the New Testament from Romans to Philemon. The third one in 1942, and this is the one we want to talk about, Studies in the New Testament from Hebrews to Revelation. He then, in 1942, also published a book called The Gospel of John, and in 1944, he published a book called The Gospel of Mark. And here's a picture of him. This is what he looked like in the lower right-hand screen. You can see when he was a younger version of himself. And then in the upper left-hand screen, you'll see him in the front row on the left-hand side. At that point, he was aging. This is when he probably was the dean of the Bible school out there in Oregon. Okay, so I said we want to talk about the book that he wrote titled Studies in the New Testament, Hebrews to Revelation. So let me read something to you taken from The Quest for Holiness and Unity by John V.W. Smith. Now, in case you don't know, John V.W. Smith was a historian for the Church of God. This is on page 313. One of the 1942 publications, printed without approval of the Gospel Trumpet Company's editorial committee, was particularly significant in that it presented a variant view of interpreting the book of Revelation. In his preface to Volume 3 of Studies in the New Testament, Hebrews to Revelation, Otto F. Linn wrote, "Since there is a great deal of controversy centered around the interpretation of many of the symbols of this difficult book, the author submits this writing with reserve. It is hoped that those who differ will have as tolerant an attitude as the writer has towards their differences." Linn's exegesis differed greatly from the standard, quote-unquote, interpretation of F.G. Smith and other earlier writers. This was the primary reason why the third volume of Linn's series was published for him by the Commercial Service Company. And this was the job printing subsidiary of the Gospel Trumpet Company, rather than the Gospel Trumpet Company itself. In dealing with the portion of Volume 3 on Revelation, Linn stated, "We must ask ourselves the question, what would this particular message mean I'm going to start that one all over. We must ask ourselves the question, what would this particular passage mean to those to whom it was directly written? Otherwise, we might develop a technique of interpretation that is wholly acceptable to the Western analytical mind, but entirely foreign to the political Oriental mind, which served as the vehicle for the divine revelation. This is a common error of interpreters." He also made quite a point against the generally accepted church historic interpretation of Revelation when he wrote, "It should also be observed that since historical situations are involved and history has a way of repeating itself, some of these symbols may find a striking fulfillment in events other than those originally intended. For this reason, people of all ages have tended to interpret the book of Revelation in light of their own time, and we may have been startled by the apparent application of some symbols to current history. It is very important to keep in mind that history repeats itself, and that such repetitions are not to be confused with the original historical situations, although the moral or lesson intended may be rightly applied to every apparent repetition." So let me give this to you from a different explanation viewpoint. Another person by the name of George Scofield. He was a professor at Anderson University School of Theology. This is kind of how he summed up Brother Otto's book. Instead of seeing the book of Revelation as describing the struggles of the church universal throughout all of its history until now, he saw John the Revelator's message reflecting the struggles of the early church against the power and persecution of the Roman Empire, especially under Emperor Domitian. By means of a series of visions, John encourages the church to hold fast to its faith in spite of the persecution. He consistently reminds the Christians through symbols whose meaning is unknown to their persecutors that God is still on his throne and ultimately will triumph. While the message of John is needed and appropriate for Christians in the first century, the message is timeless and speaks to Christians in any generation who are being persecuted. This quote can be found in Revelation Explained or Revelation Church of God Classics on page 78. So let's go back and reflect where we're at in time. I asked the question, are any of these, or could any of these been factors in re-examining the end-time teachings that have been very traditional in the Church of God from the very beginning up until this point? So by the time Linn wrote his book in 1942, it had been 62 years since the beginning of the Church of God Reformation, which, according to our charts, began in 1880. So while the fundamental message of unity was central to the Church of God in that Christians should come out of Babylon, or in other words, false church systems, and furthermore then be united with the one visible body that was both one and distinct, the Church of God had experienced two major divisions, and at that time was on the brink of the biggest split that the church would see. and that was the upcoming Earl Slacum controversy, which we will talk about later on. So while the message was unity and holiness, in practice, up until that time, there had been two major divisions. One over sanctification, we talked about that in 1899, and then one a few years later over issues such as the necktie and what the necktie represented to the more conservative element of the Church of God. Next, Warner's date-setting techniques of prophecy had concluded that 1896 would include a significant event for the church, and that Christ would return in or about 1941. Well, these 2 years came and went, and nothing happened. Certainly, Jesus' coming did not take place in 1941 or 1942, and here we are in 2024, and still Christ's coming has not happened. Furthermore, as they had labeled false church systems Babylon, and they were preaching that Babylon had fallen, okay, that was the way it was prophesied, and that therefore that God's people should come out of Babylon. In reality, at this point, 62 years into this, there were far more people being saved outside of the Church of God Reformation than inside of it. And so we're left to ask the question, why were people such as Otto Linn beginning to question the church historic perspective or interpretation of the book of Revelation? Now, I read to you earlier a quote from C.W. Naylor that was taken from the teachings of D.S. Warner and his associates. I would like to read another quote to you. This is pretty lengthy, so please bear with me here. So C.W. Naylor says, Brother Warner constantly asserted, and the rest of us reiterated, that God had forsaken the denominations, that he would no longer save souls in them. Of course, that result would naturally follow if God's called his people out of a denomination locally or generally, and himself totally deserted it. But how has this theory worked out in practice during the years? We all know that God did not cease to save souls in the denominations. We know he is still saving souls, saving every soul that turns to him, regardless of where that soul is. We know that hundreds of thousands of people are being converted in the denominations every year. This is a certainty. What does it signify? It signifies that the harvest of souls is not past, as we had supposed. It signifies that God has not ceased to work in the denominations. It signifies that we were wrong in what we taught on the subject. There is no use glossing over it. We were wrong. I see no reason to believe that fewer people are saved today in the denominations than there were 60 years ago. Can we draw any other conclusion from this but that God has not changed his attitude towards them? Denominations were always wrong. Denominations were always wrong. They are still wrong. But most of God's people are in them, and he works among his people wherever they are. So I ask you the question, was this an example of advancement, or was this apostasy? You can be the judge of that. That concludes this episode of our podcast, but I do have a couple comments that I would like to make. I have gotten some great feedback from individuals who have been watching the podcast, and let me say that I really appreciate your comments. I've gotten some constructive criticism, and I've gotten some really good insight into things that I might want to add or change, and so I thank you for that. I also want to say that if you haven't noticed by now, I'm trying to keep my bias out of this. I'm just trying to present you the evidence and the facts and then allow you to be the judge. Clearly, all of us have biases. I have mine. And I'm trying to keep that out and really be objective about this. I spent 31 years working in a career field in which we did analysis. And one of the things that I learned early on was you have to be able to identify your biases if you're going to do a proper analysis and come to a reasonable conclusion or the correct conclusion. And so I am very much aware of my biases, but I'm doing the best I can to keep those biases out of these presentations. I also want to say that my views have changed from the way I was taught. I wouldn't say that they are drastically changed, but as part of this study, I've come to the conclusion that there were some things that were not right. There's some timelines that's in question, but I still hold the church historic perspective. But again, I realize that that's a bias that I have, and so when I'm presenting these facts to you, I'm just going to try to focus on what the facts are and not tell you my opinion. If you want to know my opinion, you're welcome to contact me and I can talk to you about that. Now, that might be more difficult to do once we get into the next couple presentations where the subject matter is going to hit home, so to speak, and it's going to talk about the way that I was taught. So bear with me here. I trust that these are informative to you and that you're learning something, and I appreciate your prayers. Thank you very much.